Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started so we can get you out of here on time. Thank you for coming to our symposium. It's the Politics of Inequality and the Inequality of Politics. We have 4 speakers today. I will be starting it off, and I'll talk about how subjective socioeconomic status shapes attitudes towards redistribution. Then we'll go to Michael Krauss, who will talk about how social class rank predicts political involvement. Then we'll go to Oliver Hauser, who will talk about being unaware of inequality may actually lead to punishing poor individuals more. And then finally, we'll finish it up with Justin Friesen, who will talk about how social class hierarchy may actually fulfill needs for control. So I'll go ahead and start, and I'll talk about how subjective socioeconomic status shapes attitudes towards redistribution and can also shape associated ideological beliefs about what is fair and just. And I think it's really important to understand the psychological mechanisms which drive attitudes towards redistribution, especially now given the high level of income inequality. The United States has the highest level of income inequality as compared to all other industrialized countries. The wealthiest 1% of Americans own nearly 50% of this country's wealth. And it's not just that a lot of money has piled up into the hands of a few, but this inequality is associated with lower subjective well-being, increased crime rates, and reduced life expectancy. In other words, the more unequal the nation is, the worse the outcomes. Now recently, studies have shown that Americans would actually prefer a more equitable distribution of wealth. But somewhat counterintuitively, Americans often vote against redistributive policies which are aimed at reducing this inequality. And so this led my collaborators and I to wonder exactly what is driving people's attitudes towards redistribution. So one factor which may be driving attitudes towards redistribution is economic self-interest. That is, rich people have a lot of money, which they would like to keep, and therefore oppose redistributive policies. Whereas poor people would like more money, and therefore they support redistributive policies. And this idea was made famous by economists Meltzer and Richard when they argued that the rational voter who has an income level above the median level should oppose redistributive policies, whereas the rational voter who has an income level below the median level should support redistributive policies. Now, in the United States, there is a relationship between income and support for redistribution. But this relationship is surprisingly small. And so this suggests that while economic self-interest may be one factor which drives attitudes towards redistribution, it is not the only factor. Now, one reason that the relationship between financial assets and support for redistribution is small could be because people simply don't know how many financial resources they have. This may sound strange, but for a second, if you'll just indulge me, try to take into account all of your financial assets and boil that down into one number which represents everything. Take into account what's in your bank account, any investments, retirement plans, and any debt, and come up with one monetary number which represents everything. Now, if you're anything like me, this is actually quite a difficult task. So instead, what people may be doing is using a shortcut to holistically judge how much wealth they have as it compares to others in the social hierarchy. And this shortcut I call subjective socioeconomic status. Now, importantly, what this suggests is that attitudes toward redistribution may not be driven by economic self-interest, but may simply match how people subjectively feel in terms of how rich or poor they feel. So first, we wanted to investigate whether subjective socioeconomic status was even associated with attitudes towards redistribution. And we did this by collecting an online sample and asking people to report on their subjective socioeconomic status using the MacArthur ladder, where participants think of this actual ladder as representing the social hierarchy. Those at the top of the ladder have the most income, the best jobs, and the best education, where those at the bottom of the ladder have the least income, the worst education, and the worst jobs or no job at all. And participants are simply asked to place themselves where they think they fall along this ladder. We assess support for redistribution by assessing some global measures, such as in general, do you think the wealthy should be taxed in order to provide benefits for the poor, as well as some very specific questions, such as do you think that the federal taxes should be raised on people who make more than $200,000 annually in order to provide benefits for low-income individuals. And we hypothesized that participants who reported being high in subjective socioeconomic status would in turn be less supportive of redistributive policies. And that's exactly what we found. Participants who were high in subjective SES were less supportive of redistributive policies. And importantly, what I'm showing you here is the unique effect controlling for income, education, conservative ideology, as well as party affiliation. So these data are encouraging in that they suggest that subjective SES is associated with attitudes towards redistribution. However, these data are just correlational in nature, so we don't actually know the causal pathway. And we wanted to investigate whether subjective SES actually affects people's attitudes towards redistribution. And we did this by manipulating people's perception of their relative wealth. Participants were told that after they fill out a number of questions about their spending habits, they would get feedback about how much wealth they had compared to similar others. These questions were really specific, such as how much money goes to food, transportation, etc., as well as some general questions such as, in general, do you think of yourself as thrifty or not? However, after they filled out all of these questions, they were actually randomly assigned to learn that they had relatively more wealth or relatively less wealth than similar others. After they got their wealth feedback, we asked them the questions about support for redistribution. These are the same questions as we asked in study one, and these are questions such as, in general, the wealthy should be taxed in order to provide benefits for the poor. We hypothesized that people who are randomly assigned to learn that they had relatively more wealth would be less supportive of redistributive policies. So just to orient you to the graph here, on the x-axis, we have randomly assigned condition. On the y-axis, we have support for redistribution. This is z-scored such that higher numbers indicate more support for redistribution. And consistent with our hypothesis, we found that participants who were randomly assigned to learn that they had relatively more wealth were in turn less supportive of redistributive policies. Importantly, we investigated to see whether objective economic resources differed between condition, and they don't. So this suggests that subjective SES uniquely predicts attitudes towards redistribution. Now, we know from dissonance research that changing people's attitudes towards redistribution may actually lead to sort of knock-on effects to change people's ideologies more generally. And so we investigated this by asking participants about their political ideology with a one-item measure which ranged from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. And consistent with our hypothesis, we found that participants who were randomly assigned to the high SES condition in turn reported being more conservative than participants who were randomly assigned to the low SES condition. So these data suggest that perceptions of socioeconomic status not only shape attitudes towards redistribution, but also political ideology more broadly. Now, one issue with these data is that we were not able to control for future self-interest. That is, if participants thought, I might make actually more and more money in the future if they were randomly assigned to the high SES condition, then voting against redistributive policies now is actually the economically self-interested and rational decision. And so we wanted to investigate whether subjective status alone is driving people's attitudes towards redistribution, controlling for any future expectations. So we did this in the context of an economic game, which we called the investment game, where participants are given 40 cents of seed money, which they could invest in any way they saw fit into 6 companies. They're given only a minimal amount of information about these companies, and they're told that this game has a few rules. If you do really well in your investments, you're in the top 1/3 of earners, then even though you get to keep most of your profits, you will be assessed or taxed a little bit of that money back in order to offset others' losses. However, if you do poorly in this game, you're in the bottom 1/3 of earners, you will actually be credited or bonus back a little bit of money. Now, regardless of how participants actually invested their money, they were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. In the high status condition, participants learned that they did better than 89% of all previous other players, and while they got to keep most of their profits, they were assessed a little bit, and so afterwards, they get to walk away with an additional 12 cents. Participants in the low status condition learned that they did worse than 89% of all previous other players, but they were bonused back a little bit of money, and so they walk away with an additional 12 cents. Importantly, the outcomes here are exactly the same. In the control condition, they didn't receive any feedback until after our dependent variables of interest were completed. After participants got feedback about how they performed in the game, we told them that this is actually one investment game of many iterations of this game. And we would actually like your help as a participant to determine what the best way to proceed for the next version of this investment game. And they can do this by telling us what they think the assessment and credit rates should be. Importantly, before they were able to play with these dials, we told them two things. First, whatever they do with these dials will in no way affect the current amount of money that they walk away with. They will always walk away with an additional 12 cents. Secondly, we told them because we took their ID numbers down, they are not allowed to play any future iteration of this investment game. And so in this way, we eliminated any expectations from benefiting from these policies. Now, in this way, we created a microcosm in our game. There are status differences, and there's a system of distribution in place, and now they're able to determine what the future system should be. We also asked about ideological justifications, and these are questions such as, in general, do you think it is fair for there to be inequalities in outcomes as it pertains to the game? And we hypothesized that participants who were randomly assigned to learn they did well in the game, they're in the high status condition, would recommend less redistribution for future iterations of the game, and that ideological justifications would shift to fall in line with their attitudes towards redistribution. So again, just to orient you to the graph here, on the x-axis we have randomly assigned condition, high status meaning they did well in the game, low status meaning they did poorly in the game. On the y-axis we have recommended redistribution, and this is scored such that 0 represents the status quo, or the amount of redistribution which is in the current version of the game. Consistent with our hypothesis, we found that participants who learned they did well in the game and the high status condition recommended significantly less redistribution than participants who were randomly assigned to the low status condition. Again, we eliminated any future expectations from benefiting from these policies, so this suggests that subjective status alone or uniquely is predicting attitudes towards redistribution. And we also found that participants who were randomly assigned to the high status condition thought that inequality in outcomes in the game was significantly more fair than participants who were randomly assigned to the low status condition. So the manipulation is not only changing people's attitudes towards redistribution, but it's also changing their ideological beliefs. Now, we wanted to investigate whether this manipulation was not only changing ideological beliefs as it pertains to the game, but if it also had spillover effects into the real world. And so we investigated this by asking participants whether they thought the US system was fair. And we use a system justification measure. These are questions such as, everyone has a fair shot at wealth and happiness. And most strikingly, we found that participants who were randomly assigned to the high status condition in the game thought that the US system, more broadly, was more fair than participants who were randomly assigned to the low status condition. Now, overall, these data suggest that subjective status shapes attitudes towards redistribution, as well as people's perceptions of what is fair and just more broadly. And this is important because redistribution is fundamental to every political system. In fact, many complex formulas have been created in order to determine what is the best way to distribute financial resources in the system. But formulas do not determine which policies become implemented. People do. And so these data suggest that people's views on redistributive policies are actually not objective. In fact, they may change depending on people's subjective feelings of how rich or poor they are. And so we must remember that when we're thinking about voting on redistributive policies, we have to remember the power of how people feel. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank my collaborators, Christian Lundberg, Aaron Kay, and Keith Payne. And thank you all. I'll be happy to answer a few questions.